this is Slugger's first of several video reports we're going to do this evening, taking you from 9 o'clock GMT when we start the live blog on Slugger O'Toole. Not live, but recorded as live with as few edits as we can possibly manage. And I'm joined here by Shane Greer, who many Slugger readers will know from his regular postings recently and his regular appearances on the Nolan Show on what must be very, very early time in Washington, D.C. And we're also joined by my old friend, Ruarai McKenna, who's also in D.C. And we're really going to just start a conversation which runs something like this. Guys, how did we get here?
It's a great question, Mick. I think we have to look back to 2016, and from my perspective, this whole situation speaks to a country divided along demographic lines. And when you dig into that data, the most obvious one is the educational divide. Those without a college degree, particularly amongst white voters, much more likely to go for Trump, and those with a college degree or more likely to go for Biden. Of course, within that, you have the usual American kind of racial divides around these issues as well. So for me, how did we get here is one word, and that word is division. Arguably historic division, but it's easy to overplay that.
Yeah, I think it's worth asking where is here. And what I mean by that is throughout the Trump presidency, and particularly running into final days of this election, a lot of people talk about the trajectory the country's on and how bad things could get. Some people talk about Trump's campaign is running against the election itself, and there being dark implications for democratic accountability should he win thereafter. But I think it's worth asking, why are we constantly talking about the crisis that might come, given the crisis we're already living through? And it is worth pausing for a moment to just note how bad things are. I'm talking to you sandwiched between Wisconsin Avenue and Connecticut Avenue, and shops are boarded up. There are helicopters in the street. They've been there for a few days testing for radiation. We were out in the country at the weekend and saw a caravan of Trump supporters. We had no great problem with that. Nothing happened, but it certainly did go in a different way in Texas, where a similar type of caravan surrounded the opposition's campaign bus, and it almost caused an accident. And in response to that, the president called the people involved patriots and encouraged it, and some other members of his party encouraged it as well. So I don't think that when we talk about where we are, it's any longer enough to talk about how dangerous things could get. We are already there. And if you compare the 2020 election with the feeling going into the 2008 election, I've been in DC for almost 20 years now, and so I've been through a few of these, and there was this sense, even among Republicans who supported McCain and Peel in 2008, that if Barack Obama won, he was going to make history. And so even if you weren't in favor of that, there was a palpable sense of this is an historic moment in the United States. Today, I think it's fair to say there's a sense that we may be about to break with history, whether Trump wins or whether he loses. Because if he loses, the big question that people have is, are we even going to have a concession? Is he going to accept a peaceful transfer of power? He's actually refused to say he will so far. If he wins, then, for readers not familiar with the last 4 years, I would simply say, take out your Spanish Google translator and type in Caduo, and you get a sense of what we're in store for should he be re-elected. You're very much in the strongman rule at that point and kind of consolidating power. So where we are right now is a crisis. And yes, part of that crisis is based on how past elections have gone, but not just in terms of how people have voted, also in terms of whether they could vote and the story of voter suppression. And I think to tie it to what may happen over the next 24 hours, and potentially over the next number of weeks, depending on what the early results show, the real story of 2020 may be who wins the most votes. That should be the story. The story, just as likely, may be, are the votes even counted? You know, it's 20 years since Florida and the hanging chads, and we still don't know exactly how many people voted there then, 2 decades later. Let's hope we have some early results for the sake of stability as well as my preferred result. But that's really where we're at right now. Are we even going to have a fair election? Will all the votes be counted? And whether Trump wins or whether he loses, what will democracy look like on the other side of that?
Well, it's interesting because it's a long time since America had a bona fide landslide, and you're talking really about the second term of Ronald Reagan, and probably the last time there was a settled single idea what the United States actually looked like, the way it wanted to be seen on the international stage. There's huge conflict over that. Trump hasn't, to be fair to him, brought us into the wars that were sullenly predicted when he won in 2016. So that's one thing in his favour. But I'm really intrigued with this idea of division, not least because we all come from that little part of our shared island that's never quite been shared. So we understand this idea about the effects that culture war has on things. And I'm also really interested in some of the kind of marginal changes, the changes at the edges. You know, I would have said, even certainly with Barack Obama, that Texas was never going to be in play for the Democrats again, not after they deserted Johnson. And, you know, I think the last Democrat to get an electoral college vote was Jimmy Carter, who was Southern peanut farmer, as we may all remember or not. And yet Texas is in play. There's strange things going on in Pennsylvania. Really, that ought to be a lot closer, given that it's Biden's home patch. Ohio has always been a bit swing one way and the other, and we've been talking last time about Michigan and Wisconsin. There are some historic coalitions that seem to be fragmenting. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different things that we could talk about here, but demographics, I think, for me, are central to all of this. And I think it's easy to over fixate on the kind of, and it's an election, so of course we do, on the kind of Trump-Biden thing, or previously the Hillary-Trump thing, when a bigger question has to be asked about what lies behind all of that and what lies behind the kind of quite profound divisions in the United States, because Trump certainly didn't create them. He arguably benefited from them in his ascendancy to the highest office in the land. To your point about states potentially being in play, maybe we find out later today that they're not as in play as some people think. I mean, on a probabilistic basis, certainly this race appears to be more likely Biden's than Trump's, but Trump has a non-negligible chance of winning it again on a probabilistic basis. But why are states changing? Demographics. States are changing because of demographics. They are becoming less white. In a lot of cases, you see that with Texas, with the rising Latinx population there, and as more of those folks are voting, you see the cities, the suburbs, and so on trending more democratic. You know, I think of reason my child, Rory's child. You know, they're the first generation where white kids in that generation will be majority minority, below 50% of the population. So these are quite profound demographic shifts to the country, and we're seeing that result in other states being in play. And what's interesting about all of this in recent history is this is not new to the Republican Party. They were quite aware of this after their study following Mitt Romney's loss, where there was a huge investigation into what went wrong and where the party needed to go for there. And you could boil it down to this. The report for the Republican Party at that time was, Republican Party, we need to do a better job. And that's them, we, not me, we, neither side here, needs to do a better job of reaching out to non-white voters. Fast forward to 2016, and the very opposite was happening, notwithstanding that it does seem to be the case that this year Trump has made some inroads, again, if you can rely on the polling, has made some inroads with African-American voters and with Latinx voters. But nevertheless, this is about changing demographics. That's what's putting more states in play. That's arguably what's making the Republican Party much more reactionary and much more white voter oriented, and particularly white voters without a college degree.
That's really interesting, and I think that fits like a glove with Texas. However, there is something around the Rustbelt politics that I find really fascinating, because it goes with this ever forward-moving technology that's, if we're not careful, going to abolish all skilled and unskilled labor. And that really seems to be what was kind of it's less demographic change in those Rust Belt zones, and more disappointment with their traditional heroes, if you like, the union movement, and specifically in this game, the Democratic Party.
Yeah, let's slow down though a little bit on trying to get into the mind, as every American analyst seems to obsessed with, the mind of the diner guy in Pennsylvania. There's libraries of ink spilled on that one demographic, because that demographic has disproportionately much more power than many other demographic groups in the US. So we could talk about why they maybe moved from the Democrats to the Republicans, from what would have been a Clinton ticket to Trump, but everybody talks about that. I actually think a more interesting conversation is, if you're coming from where we are, a sectarian political environment in Northern Ireland, the first thing you notice when you arrive in the US, or at least you would have noticed if you arrived when I did in kind of the early 2000s, was that politics was a battle of ideas. It wasn't a battle of demographics, but it has become that. And I remember when I left home and arrived here and started working on political issues here, some Irish ones, some US ones, how refreshing it was to be in the persuasion game instead of simply the mobilization game. And things have changed profoundly in the 20 years since. And in many ways, what felt like the old politics of head counting at home was a preview of the politics that the US is now embracing. That said, I am not as pessimistic about the inevitability of this continuing as a lot of people, for a few reasons. I'll give you one. You open any American newspaper and you turn to the political section, and it's all about how polarized the country is. It's all about how tribal the politics has become. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it's not the whole truth. So, for example, if you look at the states of Massachusetts, of Maryland, of Vermont, those are what you would call in US terms blue states. They're Democratic leaning states, and they all have Republican governors. So people haven't just voted tribally there at the level of policy making, at the level of the governor. Similarly, if you look at Kansas, if you look at Louisiana, if you look at who those governors are, you'll find that in those very red states, you've got Democratic governors. And so there is still an argument to be won in the US about policy, about ideas. And frankly, by tonight, we may see somebody win that in a very big way. So there's an assumption that the days of a landslide are over, and maybe they are, but let's wait and let's see, because Texas is in play, Georgia is in play. It's possible you could have a really strange outcome where the Democrats win in heavily red Georgia and still lose in Florida. You may have a situation where the GOP are so keen to protect what they have in Florida and Pennsylvania that they underspend in places like Texas. And so part of that will be attributed to demography, and they'll say that, demographics are inevitable. But again, even that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If you look at the so-called Hispanic vote, and there's nothing of the sort. I mean, the Hispanic population is just as diverse as the European population. The idea that Cuban Americans think the same way as Colombian Americans or Venezuelan Americans, Chilean Americans, and so on, that this is just very lazy thinking. And, you know, it's common thinking in the US, but it is lazy. That vote could splinter in lots of different directions. There's a vote to be won there, in other words. So demographics help explain where we are and may help predict where we're going, but this isn't simply a sectarian head count yet. We still have arguments to have and arguments to be won. And if Biden does win very big tonight, which is another way of saying if Trump loses very big tonight, which is really what that would represent, I think, then you're looking at a situation where I'd say it's highly likely the GOP nominee 4 years from now isn't a white person. I mean, never mind going after the white vote. I think they would diversify their ticket and may well do that anyway. So, yes, we could talk about demographics, but there is still a politics of ideas here.
Yeah, just to comment on that, because I take all of those points largely agree with them. I think demographics are really important here in terms of what it speaks to vis-a-vis the future. You know, which is going to be the party that 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and so on from now is at the forefront of representing a plural America. You know, in which a huge range of identities make up the population. And is there, on the other hand, still going to be a party that is more and more focused on a single part of that population, largely the sort of traditional working class white vote? I think that's the kind of dichotomy we're seeing play out here. But the demographics are only going in one direction. And that doesn't bode well for any party, as the Republicans themselves identified post Mitt Romney, that doesn't embrace the change that the U.S. is seeing. And so for me, that's the important trend point here. This isn't a sectarian situation in the way Northern Ireland is, and it isn't identity politics in anything approaching the same way. And ideas still remain more important here, arguably, than they do in a lot of other places, certainly in Northern Ireland, where ideas have almost no bearing on political turnout. But demographics for me are key because it represents the changing country, and that's the battleground on which those ideas will be fought.
And this is the classic.
One piece. Go ahead.
Just to pick up on this idea, because I think it's a really interesting tension between this battle of demographics and battle of ideas. It does seem to me, looking in from the outside, America is such a huge country. It's hugely diverse, both geographically, climatically, and in terms of, you know, Rory's just talked to the whole business of there's diversity within diversity. But it's a country that's struggling to know itself, to understand itself, and to speak to itself insufficiently. I thought, in a way, Biden's attempt to make remarks, I noticed he didn't use the word speech, at that old Civil War battleground where Lincoln made his speech after Gettysburg. That was really the first time I'd seen a kind of at least an attempt to do that, although it was rather devoid of ideas. And it's sometimes hard to see where these ideas are coming through to kind of tackle what it is America's becoming.
So I think it helps to broaden the lens and compare the demographic change in the US with the demographic change to come in Europe. I used to work in microfinance and spent quite a bit of time in Guatemala and Honduras. And the thing that struck me about 15 years ago doing that work was you can see the world that's about to come into being, and the era of the Northern Hemisphere treating the rest of the planet as its playground, and then shrieking in horror when people from the Southern Hemisphere decide to come north. That's one idea that the day of which is done with. And so I think the US is just ahead of the curve on this. Yes, there will always be tension and the kind of emergence of a new order, the emergence of new cultural norms as demographics change. But by and large, if Trump's repudiated tonight, and certainly in the days ahead, and that's not a given, we'll see how that checks out. But if he's repudiated, then the US has just taken a major leap forward, not just for itself, but for every other country that's going to have to address similar questions of diversity. And when Europeans ask me, how are things so tense, or when they look at incidents of outright racist violence and say, how bad could it get? And those questions are very fair and they're very timely. I'll often ask in response, how do you think calm and stable Sweden or Denmark or Norway would react with even just a small percentage of diversity change among their population, the way the US has been able to accommodate and move forward with change on a much, much bigger scale? And I think we know the answer to that. I mean, the Scandinavian countries, the Northern European countries, they don't have a great track record of accommodating diversity. So we shouldn't be complacent that the US will get this right. There's huge trouble and huge problems. Just now, there is an old order that's clinging on for all it has. I remember, Mick, I haven't written anything for your site for a long time, but after the 2012 election, I did write a piece riffing off Ta-Nehisi Coates' question, which was, is this kind of the end of whiteness? Will there now have to be two parties that compete for a pluralistic vote? Now, we know the answer to that certainly wasn't, but it does feel as though that type of whiteness, that type of explicitly nativist, Christianist, tribal identity, I think it's kind of taken its last run on the track here. It's not going quietly into the night, but it is going. And one way or another, whether this election or the next one, it's untenable, it's unsustainable. The country's already too diverse. So I'd be more optimistic about the US navigating its way through this, starting with the Biden victory, hopefully this evening, than a lot of other people.
So, Shane, before I ask you to address that, there's an idea that was floating between the two of you before we started this conversation, and it's just something I noticed, that the first baby boomer president was elected in 1996. I think that was Clinton's first victory, I guess, was it? Or was it 92?
92.
Clinton won 92, then 96.
Okay.
And then Gore lost 2000.
Well, whoever of these two men is elected, and let's remember they're both quite old, they may not get full term, that means that the baby boomer generation, which only lasted 18 years, right, from 46 to 64, will have dominated American politics for over 30 years when this is over. Now, when you're talking about things like old order, this is an exceptionally old generation to still be in charge that long afterwards. Shane,
yeah,
not exactly to give the last word, but your kind of reaction to that idea and some of the things that Rory's been saying about the longer term game here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to argue against the inevitability of age, or I should say the inevitability of death, right? I mean, at some point, a generation dies off and can't be in power anymore. Whether these are the last kind of baby boomer candidates for highest office for the two major, who knows? It would seem statistically, it's more likely that it moves to Xers and so on. I will say this one very brief point, because I know we're close on time here. I actually think the generation that is most misrepresented and misunderstood, certainly in terms of the writing about it, remains the millennial generation, which continues to be written about and debated about as if it's still a bunch of 20, 21-year-old kids who are leaving university for the first time and trying to figure out their way in the world, and they want a flexible workplace. Millennials own houses, have kids, are really getting into the prime of their careers now, and are making very different decisions, perhaps, or I should say, have different priorities as a result. So I think that's the generation that's most misunderstood. But as for Xers and how much longer they have at the top of the stage, I think time is time leads in one direction.
It's almost as though the X generation is the Prince Charles of the kind of the general wider demographic. They've been waiting for so
it's
long.
A little bit, it gets lost in the shuffle.
Just maybe he's just not going to have his turn, and maybe the baby boomers have just been there for so long. But it does, if you think of it through that lens, it's kind of helpful to look at Ruari's idea that there's potentially a break coming here, not because Biden takes over, because he's still a baby boomer, but what he opens the door to perhaps is the promise on the other side.
I mean, I guess the cold water to pour on that to some extent is Obama was supposed to be the brick from that generation. And there was a famous article written on exactly this, riffing on the goodbye to all that. And instead, the boomers came back for one last kind of gasp.
He's a boomer.
But I think that
Obama's a boomer. I mean, I'm a boomer, so I know what a boomer looks like. I know where they come from, and I know how they think, and I know that how they've hoovered up many of the resources that haven't come tumbling down after them.
I don't think the Obamas would consider themselves the same generation as the Bidens or the Trumps or the Clintons, and they tried to market themselves as a brick from that, But maybe a more interesting question than does it take age to change the guard could be, if not age, what? And I think where you'll see the biggest change in American politics in future years, starting with tonight, is the awareness that you can no longer govern this country simply by winning a majority of the white vote. And yes, the Electoral College creates some terrible incentives and disincentives for trying to do exactly that and trying to govern by minority. But we're now at the point where minority rule isn't going to be sustainable. You can't have a rural, relatively homogeneous white population having so much power over a relatively urban and diverse, larger population. That's just not going to work. So the real question I think to ask isn't who wins the next election, but what's on the ballot. Will we, for example, have DC statehood? Will we have Puerto Rican statehood? Will we have potentially even the breaking up of a California and or a Texas into more than one state? You've got this absurd situation where the two Dakotas have, 6 electoral college votes and California has 2, and we could go through the map and look at how crazy it is. But that's, I think, the real question, not who wins future elections, but what's on the ballot there.
Right. Great. One last word from you, Shane.
I to that point about the last kind of example of winning by winning the white vote. Maybe we see that tonight. Maybe we don't. Again, probabilistically, it's more likely Biden's than Trump's. But the way I like to think about probabilities in this, if you look at say 538, who give Trump a roughly 1 in 10 chance. A lot of folks look at that and go, well, it's definitely Biden's. But if I said to you, you had a 1 in 10 chance of turning the ignition in your car and it would blow up, you're probably not going to turn the ignition in your car. The way you weight probability is directly proportional to the significance of the outcome. But I think whether it's now or whether it's the next cycle, the cycle after that, we are fast approaching the point where that is mathematically going to be the case, even if it isn't the case in certain states. And even if, as Ruarai points out, the Electoral College does create kind of perverse incentives and creates much more weighting to the interests of very small places with very few people. The trend is only going in one direction. That's not going to change. And that does mean that demographics ultimately are destiny, even if it's taking longer to get there than one might have thought only a few years ago.
That's great. Thanks, gentlemen. So we shall regroup at some point after 1:30 GMT time. That's slugger time. And we're not sure quite what's going to be happening at that stage. We're sort of hopeful that we might at least have some news from Florida and Texas. It'll be much shorter than this. It'll be much more to the point, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then maybe something a little bit closer to the end of play tonight, or at least before my bedtime, which is a little bit later than yours, guys. Thanks a million. See you later.
Good luck.